Chapter 2: Dorian's Revenge. The night after Dorian's fall was drenched in an eerie silence. The rain had stopped and the town seemed to have forgotten the storm altogether. But the streets were still wet, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. Lights flickered in houses. People settled into their routines and life carried on, as it always did. Except for Dorian. He lingered at the edge of the alley where his body had fallen, his ghostly form watching as the police came and went, marking off the scene, covering his lifeless body in a white sheet. For a while, he could hear the hushed conversations of the officers, their words punctuated by the crackling of radios. "Freak accident," one of them had said. "Poor kid must have slipped in the rain." Another officer, older and grayer, nodded solemnly. "Shame. Looks like no foul play, just kids being kids, probably." He had wanted to scream, to shout at them that it wasn't an accident, that Liam and his gang had chased him to his death. But no one could hear him. No one could see him. He was alone. As the officers packed up and left, the world around him grew quieter still. Hours passed, though he had no sense of time anymore. Time felt meaningless, a concept that only belonged to the living. Now all that was left was the lingering cold, the chill of the void that surrounded him. But within that cold, something else stirred. A deep, simmering rage. They were going to get away with it. Liam, Jake, Tyler, Mason, Ryan. His mind conjured their faces, each one clearer than the last. He could still hear their laughter echoing in his ears, the mocking tone of Liam's voice as he kicked him in the ribs, as if his pain was some kind of joke. They were probably home now, dry and warm, pretending nothing had happened. No guilt, no remorse. Just like they always did. That was when he felt it. That same pulse of energy deep within him, growing stronger with each breath he no longer needed to take. The rage was a living thing now, feeding on his thoughts, his memories, his actions. It swirled around him like a vortex, drawing in the darkness of the night, until he was no longer just Dorian Harper. He was something more, something twisted by pain and anger. He stared at the empty street, his vision sharpening, his senses heightening in ways he had never experienced before. He could feel the energy flowing through him, but he didn't understand it. All he knew was that it made him stronger, more powerful. And with that power came a terrible urge, to punish, to make them suffer. With no conscious thought, his form shifted. One moment he was standing in the alley, the next he was somewhere else, transported by a force he didn't understand but instinctively knew how to use. When he opened his eyes, he was standing in a somewhat familiar living room. He visited this house frequently when he was much younger. The walls were painted a dull beige, covered in posters of sports cars and celebrity athletes. The sound of a television droned in the background, but Dorian paid it no mind. His attention was focused on the boy sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the screen. Liam, his tormentor. He and Dorian had once been childhood friends who spent their younger days playing in the streets together with the other neighborhood kids. Back then, things were simple. Long afternoons spent kicking a ball around or riding their bikes until the sun dipped below the horizon. But as they grew older, something changed. Liam began to drift away. By the time they entered high school, the boy Dorian had once called a friend had transformed into something entirely different. Liam fell in with his cousin Jake, whose bad reputation was well earned. Jake introduced Liam to Tyler, another troublemaker, and soon enough the group expanded to include Mason and Ryan, each more toxic than the last. Their bond as friends shattered in those years. Instead of the easy camaraderie they once shared, Liam began to view Dorian as a target. What had once been childhood innocence twisted into cruelty, and he found himself at the center of Liam's scorn. The torment escalated, a sharp betrayal that haunted him throughout his high school days, as the boy who had once been a companion became the ringleader of those who made his life unbearable. And there he was again, sitting comfortably in his living room. His face was pale, his expression vacant, as though he were lost in thought. His feet were propped up on the coffee table, and he absent-mindedly scrolled through his phone, checking messages and notifications that seemed meaningless now. Every few seconds he would glance at the window, as if expecting something, or someone, to be there. He could sense the fear in him. It wasn't overwhelming, not yet, but it was there, simmering just beneath the surface. Liam could try and forget, and while he could pretend that it didn't affect him, his body betrayed that notion. His shoulders were tense, his movements too sharp, too quick. Good, Dorian thought, his anger flaring once again. He wants to be afraid? I'll give him something to be afraid of. Without warning, the lights in the room flickered. The television screen distorted, static crackling across the image, and the sound cut out abruptly. Liam frowned, glancing around the room in confusion. The hell, he muttered, lowering his phone. The lights flickered again, this time longer, before going out completely. The room plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the pale moon outside the window. Liam stood up, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Mom?" he called, his voice wavering slightly. "Did the power go out?" There was no response. The house was still, silent. He reached for his phone again, but before he could unlock it, the room filled with a low, unsettling hum, a vibration that seemed to come from the very walls around him. His eyes widened, his breath quickening as he looked around, trying to find the source of the noise. "Dad?" he called out, louder this time. Nothing. The hum grew louder. Dorian smiled, or at least the ghostly version of a smile. It wasn't the kind of expression he would have worn in life, but in death it came naturally. He could feel the power surging through him, could feel the energy coursing through the house, twisting the very air around them. He was in control now. Liam took a step forward, but his foot caught on something unseen, and he stumbled, nearly falling. His phone slipped from his hand and clattered to the ground, its screen lighting up for just a second before going black. And then, without warning, the hum stopped. The silence was deafening. For a moment he stood frozen, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his eyes wide with terror. Then from somewhere deep in the house came a sound, a low, guttural moan like the wind passing through a tunnel, except this wind carried something far darker with it. Liam spun around urgently. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "Who's there?" The moan grew louder, more distinct, as if it were moving closer, traveling through the walls, through the very air itself. And then, slowly, impossibly, the shadows in the room began to move. Dorian watched, his spirit hovering just behind Liam, unseen but very much present. He could feel the darkness responding to him, bending to his will. It wrapped itself around the room like a shroud, creeping closer to his target, suffocating the air around him. Liam stumbled back, his hands shaking as he groped for the light switch. His fingers found it and he flicked it up and down repeatedly, but nothing happened. The room remained dark, the shadows shifting and twisting like living things. The moaning grew louder, more insistent, until it became a chorus of voices whispering his name, calling to him from every direction. Liam. The sound echoed through the room, 1,000 voices speaking at once. Liam. His breathing came in ragged gasps now, his eyes darting around wildly. "Stop it!" he shouted. "I said stop it!" But the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, more frantic, until they filled the room with a deafening roar. He watched, his ghostly form darkening with each passing second. This was it. This was what he had wanted. To see him terrified, to see him suffer the way he had suffered for many years. And it felt good. Better than he could have imagined. He reached out, his hand ghosting over Liam's shoulder. He could feel the icy cold of his touch seep into his skin, and the boy flinched, recoiling from the invisible presence. "Who's there?" he screamed, his voice cracking once again with desperation. He leaned in closer, his face inches from his ear. "I'm here," Dorian whispered, his voice low and cold. "I'll always be here." The boy's eyes widened in terror and he spun around, but there was nothing there. Just shadows and darkness. But he wasn't done. Not yet. The shadows in the room coalesced, forming a shape. A figure, tall and gaunt, its face hidden in shadow. The air grew colder still, and the figure began to move toward him, its footsteps slow, deliberate. Liam backed away, his body shaking uncontrollably. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible now. "Please, stop." He continued to watch, his anger burning hotter than ever. He could end this now. He could stop the torment, let him go. But a darker part of him, one that had been growing since his death, wanted more. It wanted to see him broken, to see him beg for mercy. But then, just as he was about to strike again, something shifted. A pull, faint but undeniable, tugged at him from deep within. It was like a thread, pulling him away from the room, away from Liam. The figure he had conjured wavered, then dissolved into the shadows, leaving Liam trembling and alone in the darkness. Dorian felt the pull again, stronger this time. It wasn't the same as before when he had moved from one place to another. This was different. It was pulling him away, out of the house, out of the world he had once known. He resisted at first, trying to stay, trying to finish what he had started. But the pull was too strong, dragged him back to the place where it had all begun. The alley. And there, waiting for him, was the dark figure he had seen before. "You should not have done that," the mysterious figure said, its voice cold and distant. Dorian didn't respond. He could feel the darkness inside him swirling, growing stronger. He didn't care about the consequences. He didn't care about what came next. All that mattered was revenge. He loved that feeling, seeing him suffer, crying, begging for him to stop. Chapter 3. The Spirit of Regret. The next day dawned gray and bleak, the sky thick with heavy clouds that hung low over the town. It was the kind of day that made everything feel suffocating, the air stagnant, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Dorian drifted through the streets unnoticed, unseen by the living. His sense of time was slipping. Hours stretched endlessly, blending in a haze of anger and confusion. He didn't know how long it had been since that evening at Liam's. Maybe a few hours, even days. Time had lost meaning. All that mattered was the cold, gnawing hunger inside him, the need for revenge. Liam had felt a snippet of it that night, the terror, the helplessness. But it hadn't been enough. Dorian had left him shaking but not broken, shattered. Not the way he had been torn, repeatedly, into little pieces. No, Liam still had more fear to give, more suffering to endure. And the others, they had barely even begun to pay. Jake, Tyler, Mason, Ryan. Their names were etched in his mind, each one a reminder of the torment they had inflicted, each one a target for his growing wrath. But even as he floated through the streets, his thoughts dark and tangled, something else gnawed at him. It was a faint, distant feeling, like a whisper at the back of his mind, barely audible, but insistent. It had started after he left Liam's house, tugging at him, pulling him back toward the place of his death, toward the alley. He didn't want to go there, didn't want to see it again. But the pull was strong, and with every moment he resisted, the sense of unease grew. It was mid-morning by the time Dorian found himself standing at the edge of the alley. The street was empty, save for a few cars parked along the curb and the occasional passerby hurrying by without a glance. No one would ever guess what had happened here. The world moved on, indifferent to the violence that had been done. His body was gone now, taken away by the authorities, but the memory of it lingered in the air, like a stain that couldn't be washed away. Dorian stared at the spot where he had fallen, where his life had been so violently cut short. His chest tightened with a feeling he couldn't quite name. Rage? Fear? Grief? It was all of them, and none of them swirling together in a chaotic storm that refused to settle. "You're still here." The voice came from behind him, soft and hollow, like wind through an empty graveyard. Dorian turned, and there it was again, the dark figure looming just at the edge of the alley, its form half hidden in shadow. It was taller than before, or maybe he had shrunk since the last time he'd seen it. Its features were still indistinct, its face obscured by darkness, but its eyes, those hollow black eyes, They were fixed on him, watching with a cold, detached interest. "What do you want?" he asked, though his voice felt strange in this form, like it wasn't really his anymore. The figure stepped forward, its long, skeletal fingers brushing the air between them. "It is not a matter of what I want. It is what you want that concerns me." He narrowed his eyes. He didn't trust this thing, whatever it was. He had felt its presence since the night of his death, always lurking at the edge of his awareness, watching, waiting. But it had never spoken to him until now. "What do you mean?" he demanded. "I want justice. I want them to suffer for what they did to me." The figure tilted its head, as if considering his words. "Justice? Is that what you call it?" Its voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that made him uneasy. "Yes," he snapped. "They killed me. I want them to pay for it." The figure stepped closer, and the air around them seemed to darken, the shadows growing longer and deeper. "Do you?" it asked quietly. "Or is it something else you seek?" He clenched his fists, though they no longer felt solid, no longer felt like his hands. "What else would I want?" The figure was silent for a moment, its gaze steady, unblinking. "Revenge is a poison. It consumes those who seek it. You think you are in control, but already it is changing you." He felt a cold shiver run through him, but he shook his head, refusing to believe it. "No, I'm not changing. I'm just doing what they deserve." The figure's eyes gleamed in the darkness. "You are wrong. The more you cling to this hatred, the more it will twist you, turn you into something else. You have already begun to lose yourself." Dorian flinched at the words, though he didn't want to admit they had any truth. But deep down, something inside him stirred, a flicker of doubt. He had felt that night, in that moment when the shadows had answered his call, when the darkness had swirled around Liam like a living thing. It had been intoxicating, that feeling, that control. But it had also been terrifying. The shadows had seemed to have a will of their own, and for a moment he had wondered if he was the one controlling them, or if they were controlling him. The figure sensed his hesitation, and it took another step forward, its presence growing more oppressive. "You think you are punishing them, but in reality, you are only punishing yourself. Each act of vengeance pulls you further from the light that you seek." "What do you mean, further from the light?" The figure raised a hand, gesturing toward the sky, though he saw nothing but gray clouds. "Heaven? When you died, there was a path for you, a way forward toward peace. But you rejected it. You chose to remain here, bound by your anger. And every moment you stay in this realm, the path to the afterlife grows narrower." He felt a surge of panic rising suddenly. "No, I didn't reject anything, he faltered, searching for the right words. "I just wasn't ready to go yet. I wasn't done." The figure's voice softened, almost pitying. "Few ever are, but the longer you stay, the more difficult it will be to leave." A cold realization settled over him. He had felt something slipping away from him, but he hadn't wanted to acknowledge it. That warmth, that light he had felt in the moments after his death. It had been faint at first, a gentle pull toward something beyond. But with every passing hour, it had dimmed, until now it was nothing more than a distant memory. He hadn't just stayed behind. He had been drifting further from the very thing that could give him peace. "Can I still go?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Can I still find the path?" The figure was silent for a long moment. "Perhaps," it said at last. "But it is not as simple as it once was. The light you seek is fading. You may find it, or you may lose yourself entirely. The choice is yours." Dorian felt a knot tighten in his throat. "And if I lose myself?" The figure's eyes gleamed with something dark, something ancient and unknowable. "Then you will become like so many others, trapped between worlds, a shadow of what you once were. You will be consumed by the very darkness you now wield." He swallowed hard, his mind racing all the while. The thought of losing himself, of becoming some twisted, vengeful spirit, haunted him more than any revenge could satisfy. But the anger still burned inside him, a flame that refused to be extinguished. "I can't just let them get away with it," he muttered, more to himself than to the figure. "They have to pay." The figure took another step forward, its presence looming over him like a dark cloud. "And what will that accomplish? You are already dead. Their suffering will not bring you back. It will not give you peace." Dorian looked down at the ground, the weight of the figure's words sinking in. So people just get to do what the hell they want to others and without consequences? Who said there won't be consequences for those who wronged you? There will be. The figure paused, its voice cold. But it's not for you to decide. He knew deep down that the figure was right. But the anger, the hatred, it was still there, gnawing at him, pushing him to act. "I don't know how to stop," he whispered. "I don't know how to let go." That is the hardest part of death. Letting go of what you were, of the life you once had. But if you do not, you will be lost forever. He closed his eyes, the storm inside him raging. He could feel the pull of the afterlife, faint and distant, but it was there. And he could feel the darkness too, closer, stronger, ready to claim him if he let it. When he opened his eyes again, the figure was gone, vanished into the shadows as if it had never been there. But its words lingered, echoing in his mind. "You will be consumed by the very darkness you now wield." He stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where the figure had been. His thoughts were a tangled mess of doubt and rage, fear and confusion. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know if he could stop. But he did know one thing. The path to the afterlife was fading. And if he didn't find a way to change, soon, it would be lost to him forever.